Good morning, afternoon, or evening. The safety conversation continues. Today, I want to address one of those topics you guys assume is very obvious, and it is on what we call PPEs, personal protective equipment. Many times, I've seen that if today I made you the safety manager of your business, most of you would rush to finding out what PPEs don't we have. Who is supposed to wear a helmet? Who is supposed to wear a reflective jacket? But really, what is PPE? Let me define the word PPE. PPE means personal protective equipment, right? So a personal protective equipment is something you wear so that it creates a physical barrier between you and the exposure. For example, if it is dust, you're basically applying a mask, which is going to be a physical barrier between your respiratory system and the dust that is in the environment. So basically, anywhere you go and someone gives you a mask, automatically they are giving you a statement that we have dust in our working environment, so please put on this mask. But where do we go wrong on PPE? We go wrong on PPE because we assume it is the alpha and the omega of safety. Let me actually surprise you by telling you that PPE is actually the lowest, or rather the last resort as far as control of hazards is concerned. What am I talking about? There's something we call the hierarchy of control of hazards. And where does it start? It begins by elimination. That if there is a hazard, you can eliminate so that you don't need to do anything about it. Just completely do away with it so that no one is exposed. That is the first option. If that is not possible, then you come to what we call substitution, where we say, instead of using chemical A, which is more hazardous, can we use chemical B, which is safer? All right? And I'd give an example. Instead of using a candle, which is likely to burn your house, then we say, why don't we buy a rechargeable torch, which is actually safer for lighting when the lights go off? That is substitution. The third one is what we call engineering controls. Engineering controls is where you modify the process, you modify the workplace, so that whatever the hazard or rather the exposure is, the employee is basically put away from it, or you basically isolate them from that process. I'll give an example. Instead of someone basically picking a bucket and going up the ladder to feed it into the tank, you bring in maybe a conveyor, all right? Something that scoops, it could be a bucket conveyor, it scoops, takes it up, drops, comes back, scoops, take it back. So that is an engineering control. When you go for X-ray, the guy comes and sets you up and tells you how to stand, how to put your hand, and then he goes into a room that is properly secluded from the rays so that you're the only one getting the X-ray, not the technician. That is actually an engineering control. Then fourth is what we call administrative controls. So we have the hazards in the workplace, but then how do we ensure that we are able to control them using admin controls? Admin controls would be something like what? Shifts. That you get exposed for 2 hours, you take a shift, you take a break, someone else comes in. It could be training. We are building more capacity so that you understand the hazard and are able to be more intentional when you're working around it. It could be job rotation. So this week you're working in this department, the other week you're working in the other department. Basically just to make sure that you're not exposed for too long. And then the last one in the hierarchy of control of hazards is what we are talking about today, and that is a PPE. And I'm not saying just because it is a last resort, or rather the last one in the hierarchy of control of hazards, that it is not important. And particularly, especially for those people who think that you're actually not exposed. For workers in the factories, we actually have standards for every role. So you'll find masks. You have 5 different masks in the same industry. So you'll find someone who is just doing sweeping and just exposed to dust, they have a dust mask. Someone who is dealing with fumes, they actually have a gas mask. Someone else who is dealing with maybe welding fumes has also a different kind of a mask because they are different. And for some of us, we assume that a mask, ukishava ile ya grey, ya COVID ama ya blue, then it protects you against dust, it protects you against fumes. That is not true. Dust particles are so big, they can be filtered by that mask. You go with that into a gas environment, you'll inhale the gas even with that mask because it is meant to protect you from dust and probably some aerosols. Okay? Another fallacy, that gloves need gloves. And with the emergence of cleaning companies, most of you give your employees the latex gloves, zile za white. So kila mtu amevaa glove ya white, ile ya daktari. Alright? Yet, this person is coming into contact with harsh chemicals. And I gave an example of what you use as a toilet cleaner. That thing is made of an acid. Latex gloves does not protect them from that. Alright? What would protect them? Butyl rubber. You know that red glove or the black long glove? That is actually what they would need to use. But then you give them a box of the white gloves to use, whether they are just dealing with water or they are dealing with chemicals. So the fallacy is that a glove is just a glove. My advice would be, let the gloves be fitted to the exposure. If it is the chemicals, get a chemical resistant glove. If you're dealing with an acid, get an acid resistant glove. If you're just dealing with wet conditions, then you could just do your latex or your normal nitrile gloves. And something we also to consider is, does it fit your employee? Because if I wear a glove that is dangling at the edge of the fingers, it actually becomes a hazard rather than becoming a protective device. Because if it does not feel well, it does not fit well, chances are I'll not use it, or it's actually going to expose me to entrapment. Assume I'm working next to a machine and I'm wearing an oversized overall. What does that do to me? It exposes me to the risk of being entrapped into a machinery moving part because it does not fit well, for example. I've seen people wear their dust coats and then it is open. So it is actually looking like wings as you walk. It is an extension. You're supposed to properly button that overall or that dust coat so that there is no part that is actually basically going touching all the machines around where you're walking, because it can become your source of entanglement. It can actually be a source of the accident that will happen in the workplace. You're using, yes, the PPE, but using it wrongly is actually going to expose you. All right? So what are we saying? Choose the right PPE for the right job. And how do you do that? There's information on the internet on what to use. If you're dealing with a gas, if you're dealing with dust, if you're dealing with fumes, get to know what to use. Some of you, purely your work is welding. You're running our fabrication workshop. But what have you provided to your welders? Only the welding goggles. You forget that what you need is a face shield. Why a face shield? The radiant heat that comes from an arc when you're doing welding is enough to scar the skin of a welder. In fact, I want you to look at most your Kali welders and look at their face. If their face is not peeling, it has already turned dark. Why? Because the heat released during an arc weld is so much that the radiant heat burns the skin, which is why you actually need a face shield and not just the welding goggles. But some of you assume as long as the eyes are protected, then they are okay to weld. They are not. They are actually breathing and inhaling the welding fumes, which they are not supposed to. So with a proper face shield, they are able to, number one, be protected from the fumes, and number two, they are protected from the radiant heat that comes from arc welding. So basically this conversation is just to make you more intentional. And I'm targeting even the people who buy the PPE, because I've seen a big disconnect between the user and the buyer. When I request for gloves, procurement will rush to the suppliers and say, give me quotations for gloves. They don't know what these gloves will be used for. It could be the loaders. The loaders probably require a grip glove, something that has a grip to reduce the risk of exertion. So what do they need? They need diamond grip gloves. What do you get them? You get them leather gloves that are supposed to be used by the person doing form work. Sahili anafunga chuma. So that disconnect is what I want us to address. And how do you address it? Number one, proper training. Can you train the people based on the hazards that are in your workplace? And how do you know which hazards are in your workplace? Call us for an audit. Let's identify the hazards for you. Let's discuss during the risk assessment. And we'll tell you, for this kind of work, activity A, the gloves you need are maybe nitrile gloves. For activity B, you need leather gloves. For activity C, you need butyl rubber. For activity D, you need the diamond grip gloves. So there is no PPE that is supposed to do all tasks in your workplace. So you can't go buying a bulk of just masks for everyone. The guy exposed to gas, the guy exposed to dust, all of them are given the same mask in the workplace. That is basically just to tell us that we need to create awareness on the hazards that are present, match the hazard to the type of PPE that is required for that particular task. And where you have no idea, please feel free to call us, DM us, or even email us. Tell us your activities, and for each activity, we'll be able to advise you on the right PPE that you need to use. But remember, PPE are your last resort. If there is anything else you could do, either eliminate, substitute, engineering controls, or admin controls, even before you come to the PPE, then go for those options. But where you must use PPE, well and good. Choose the right PPE for the right task. Thank you.